My name is Isaac, and for the last few years I thought I was living a quiet, successful life.
Prussian.
I am 34, an industrial design consultant, spending my days sketching prototypes and ensuring safety gear meets the highest standards.
Vase.
It is boring, steady work, but it paid for the house, the car, and the comfortable life I shared with my wife Vanessa. Vanessa, however, always made it clear that boring was a synonym for failure in her vocabulary. She constantly complained that I was too predictable, too stable, and that my life lacked the fire she so desperately craved.
Friend.
Her best friend Betty was always there to fan the flames, acting like a social media commentator who lived her life for an audience that wasn't there.
Beast.
Betty would nod, record her voice notes, and tell Vanessa, girl, you deserve a man who lives on the edges, not a man who calculates stress loads for a living.
You're right.
I tried to be the husband she wanted, even if I didn't know how to play the role of a risk taker. One Tuesday, I left work early, stopping at a Thai place to pick up the extra crispy noodles she always obsessed over.
Yunwen.
I thought maybe today we could sit on the patio and find a way back to the people we were before the tension started.
Pheasant.
I pulled into the driveway at 11:30, and the first thing that hit me was the silver sedan parked 4 houses down. It was my father's car.
Vehicle. Better than my own.
He had just finished detailing it, obsessing over the finish, like he was preparing for a competition.
Thing.
He didn't park in front of our house, he parked just far enough away to maintain a pathetic veneer of discretion.
You.
My father had always been a hovering presence in our lives, a man who couldn't stop himself from fixing things that didn't need his attention. He showed up uninvited. He doted on our 3-year-old son, Owen, with a strange intensity, often making comments about the boy's eyes that made my skin crawl. Standing there on the sidewalk, looking at that cold engine, a feeling of deep, sick dread settled into my marrow. I walked up the driveway, the front door unlocked, the house unnervingly silent.
Fixed.
The television was humming in the living room, but the volume was turned down so low it sounded like a ghost whispering. On the coffee table sat 2 mugs.
Things.
One was stained with Vanessa's signature, dark red lipstick. The other was pristine and untouched. I didn't call out. I didn't make a sound, because some part of me already knew what was waiting upstairs.
Thing.
As I moved toward the staircase, the silence was broken by a soft, melodic sound that I recognized instantly.
It was.
Vanessa's breathy laugh, the one she only saved for intimate moments, followed by the low, gravelly rumble of my father's voice. My heartbeat became a hammer against my ribs, each thud deafening in the stillness of the hallway.
You bought.
I pushed open the bedroom door, and the floor didn't just feel like it was disappearing. It turned into an abyss. My father was half-clothed, his hands roaming over my wife's body with a terrifying, practiced familiarity.
Fig you they?
Weren't. Startled. They looked at me with the cold, detached gaze of people who had been caught doing something they felt entitled to.
Fruits.
Vanessa scrambled to cover herself. Her face flushed, but my father simply stood up, smoothing his shirt with an irritating, calm arrogance.
Fin.
He looked at me, not with shame, but with the annoyed expression of a man whose business meeting had been interrupted by a nuisance.
Frogson. We need to sit down.
He commanded, as if he were holding a board meeting, not destroying his own son's life. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply turned around and walked out, my body functioning on a cold mechanical autopilot.
Followed.
They followed me to the dining table, sitting on the opposite side, presenting themselves like a united corporate front. Dot! Vanessa's voice trembled, but it was hollow scripted.
Thing it gets.
Not what you think. There is history here. We were close long before I met you. She started. I looked at them, my voice sounding like it was coming from a different room, and asked, "Are you sleeping together?"
Inside scenes.
What's up, Reddit? My father didn't hesitate, meeting my gaze with a chilling confidence. It's more than that. We are in love, and we were hoping you could be mature about this.
Felt.
I felt something snap. Deep inside me, a silent detonation of everything I had ever believed about family and loyalty.
False.
Vanessa chimed in, trying to play the victim. We didn't want to hurt you. We wanted to keep things stable for your sake.
Fingered.
My father leaned forward, unfolding a plan he had clearly orchestrated in his mind, treating my life like a manufacturing project.
Fingy.
But we separate our private lives this. keeps the peace and maintains stability for young Owen, he said.
Feuds.
He even smiled, a smug, satisfied expression, clearly believing he was solving a problem rather than committing a moral atrocity.
You might.
He thought he could manage me, just like he had managed my mother for 18 years, just like he had managed every aspect of my life. I stood up, and for the first time in my life, I looked at him not as a father, but as a predator I had finally identified. I am not a part of your design, and I am not a problem. You can fix, I said, my voice steady for the first time.
Fanged.
I walked out of the house, leaving them sitting there with their logical solution, and headed straight to my friend Lucas' place.
Frying it.
Lucas listened to the entire story, his jaw tight, his hands forming fists, and he told me the only thing that mattered. You don't get angry, Isaac. You get documentation. And then you get a lawyer.
Few months were a masterclass in calculated retribution. Dot.
I quietly gathered every text, every time-stamped photo of his car, and I hired a private investigator to dig into their history.
Found.
Was worse than the affair. They had been siphoning my joint savings into a private account for years, preparing for an escape.
E.
When the day finally came for the family assembly, they thought I was there to discuss the terms of our arrangement.
Faced.
I walked into the living room, where my entire extended family was gathered, Vanessa, and my father looking smugly expectant. I didn't say a word, I just hit the play button on the tablet connected to the living room speakers.
You.
It was audio of them planning the theft of my accounts, followed by the confession of their affair, recorded the very day I caught them. The silence that filled the room was not the silence of my home, but the heavy, suffocating silence of judgment. My father's face, drained of color, his ego collapsing in real time, as my family stared at him with absolute disgust.
Things.
Vanessa tried to speak, but the look on her mother's face stopped her dead in her tracks. I didn't need to say a word, I just handed the legal documents to my lawyer, who stood by the door with a stack of papers ready for service.
Legion.
We sued for everything, the money, the house, and full custody of Owen, using their own words as the primary evidence.
Thin.
The court case was quick and brutal for them, as the judge did not look kindly on a father-in-law and daughter-in-law scheme.
Being.
Vanessa lost everything, ending up in a small, cramped apartment, while my father was ostracized by the only community he ever cared about. I got everything back, but more importantly, I got my freedom.
Didn't adapt to their sick world.
I burned it to the ground and built something new from the ashes. Justice wasn't loud or dramatic. It was cold, precise, and entirely final.
Today.
I watch Owen play in the yard, and for the first time I don't feel like I'm looking at someone else's child. I am the man who protects him, and that is all that matters.
Fingju.
The boring life I once lived is gone, replaced by a clarity that only comes when you stop hiding from the truth. I finally realized that the only person who can define your worth is yourself.
Music.
They thought they could manage my life like a product, but they forgot one thing. I am the one who designs the future. And as for them, they are just a mistake in the prototype phase, permanently discarded.
Easing. The air in the room was thin, icy, and suffocating.
I found myself gasping, trying to pull oxygen into lungs that felt like they were collapsing under the weight of a sudden, brutal truth.
4 o'clock.
I had navigated my way to my best friend Lucas. House my hands trembling so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. I poured everything out to him, every jagged detail, every horrifying realization.
50.
Lucas sat perfectly still, listening without a single interruption, his jaw clamped shut until the muscles stood out like iron cables.
Thanksin.
When I finally finished, he looked at me, his eyes cold and clinical, and told me that we had to start building our fortress immediately.
Fiction.
I needed a lawyer, and I needed to safeguard my world before they could rewrite the history of what happened. Lucas spent his days in risk management. He saw life as a series of threats and strategic mitigations.
Beat.
Right then, that was the only language I could speak. I spent that entire night slumped on his couch, eyes wide open staring at the ceiling, while every memory I had foolishly ignored played back on an endless agonizing loop.
Remote.
The next morning, I reached out to my mother, my voice tight as I told her I needed 20 minutes of her time. It was about Dad.
Beansadet.
When I arrived at her home and laid out the reality of the betrayal, the color drained from her face, leaving her ghost white before a volcanic rage took over. She shouted that he had betrayed her, and now he was doing the same to me, and she reached for her phone to call him immediately. I stopped her, my grip firm on her wrist.
Fond.
I explained that a reckless reaction now would only hand him the ammunition he needed to paint me as the unstable one, the villain in his narrative. I refused to let him hold the reins of this story for 1 second longer.
He asked what she could do, how she could help.
I gave her clear instructions. No messages, no back and forth negotiations, and if anyone reached out, direct them to me.
Phase, I added.
That if he dared to show up at her doorstep, she was to keep the door locked and ignore him entirely. Then I looked her in the eyes and said the truth that neither of us wanted to admit out loud.
Feel a shred of guilt, Mom.
He only feels like he's been inconvenienced by us finding out. Her expression hardened, the shock replaced by a painful, sharp recognition.
Vision.
Before I walked out the door, she apologized for failing to protect me from him all these years. I told her that wasn't her burden to carry anymore. This time, I was the one protecting myself.
Frightened.
Throughout the following week, Vanessa and my father sent a barrage of messages. They were long, manipulative essays about how we just needed to sit down and talk, how they understood.
Meaning no.
I was feeling hurt and how a real family could overcome anything if we just acted with maturity. I didn't answer a single one. I saved everything. The screenshots, the timestamps.
Forwarded.
Every last bit of that digital trail to Lucas. Lucas delivered on his promise and brought in Patterson, a shark in the world of family law, a man known for tearing through cases with surgical precision.
Friday.
I brought the entire Everyth timeline, the messages, the wreckage of my life. Patterson leafed through it, his face neutral, before delivering two hard truths.
First.
The house was strictly mine. It had been purchased before the marriage, and my prenup was ironclad. Second. He insisted I needed a paternity test. That second point hit me like a sledgehammer to the ribs.
Ew.
I had been shoving that thought into the darkest corner of my mind, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but Patterson laid it out with chilling logic.
The timeline.
The way my father hovered around, little Owen, the offhand comment, Sid all pointed toward a reality. I was terrified to verify. He told me I needed absolute certainty.
Prison.
I went back to Lucas' place that night, drifting in and out of a restless, feverish sleep. I kept replaying every moment it'd spent with Owen. He was 3 years old, obsessed with model trains and plastic dinosaurs.
He called me Data.
He looked at me with an adoration that made me feel like I was the center of his universe.
Feed.
I remembered how he'd instinctively reach for my hand whenever we crossed the street, or how he'd curl up on my chest, fast asleep while we watched movies. These moments felt so heavy with love, so profoundly real, at least they had to me. The boy even had my eyes.
Fizu.
The next morning, I took Owen to a private pediatric clinic under the guise of a routine checkup, secured the DNA sample, and rushed it to a lab Patterson trusted. Paid a premium for express processing, and sent a second independent sample to another facility just in case. Meanwhile, Vanessa was posting incessantly on social media. New beginnings. Living my truth.
Reason.
Strong women don't apologize for wanting more. Betty, her best friend, was stuck to the comment section like a leech fueling the fire with praise. You're glowing. This is your season. Real ones know. It made my stomach churn with such intensity. I almost hurled my phone against the wall. I saved every single post. 8 days later, Patterson called. There was no fluff, no easing into the blow. Owen wasn't mine.
Fix. 0% probability.
The second lab confirmed the devastating result 2 days after that.
Ego that.
I sat in my car in the quiet office parking lot, staring at the document until my knuckles turned bloodless against the steering wheel.
Reese.
I was trying to process the fact that my own father hadn't just betrayed me, he had tried to replace me in my own life. I had spent 3 years raising his son believing he was my legacy.
Vipers.
The midnight feedings, the first steps of every single milestone, was built upon a mountain of lies. I drove to a remote, empty park and sat on a bench, watching the sky bleed into dark, heavy gray.
Thought about Owen's first words. Data. I.
I thought about the hours I spent teaching him to stack blocks, the way his tiny fingers gripped mine when he was finding his balance.
Felt every ounce of that felt like a beautiful, living memory.
None of it was mine to claim. For 1 hour, I allowed myself to fully break. I felt the theft, the violation,
The agony of having 3 years of fatherhood.
ripped away by two people who had sat across the table from me, day after day, watching me live the lie they had orchestrated. Then I dialed Lucas and told him everything.
Fade.
He remained silent for a long, heavy moment before saying, we needed to meet in Personi shouldn't be alone. We met at a diner, a neutral ground where the noise of the world couldn't reach us. Lucas asked me what I wanted to do.
Told him everything.
Paternity fraud. Divorce. Full-scale scorched earth. I was finished with the silence.
Feed.
He warned me to take one night to be absolutely certain, because once I pulled this trigger, there was no turning back. I told him I'd been sure since the very moment I opened that bedroom door and saw the truth for what it was.
Abuse.
Now, I was making mine. But first, I needed to look Vanessa in the eye and let her know that the charade was over. That night, I sent her a message.
You met.
I told her I'd be over the next day to collect a few things and have a conversation.
From it.
She responded. Almost. Instantly, sounding desperate and eager she had been waiting for me to reach out. She missed me. Maybe we could work something out. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reply.
Vixon.
The next afternoon, Lucas accompanied me. Vanessa opened the door looking as though she'd been prepping for a reunion hair-styled makeup. Perfect, a practiced, fragile smile on her face.
He tried to invite me to talk in private.
But I told her Lucas was staying. This wasn't a conversation for just the two of us. We sat in the living room while Owen was at daycare, right where I wanted him far away from the toxicity.
You.
I told her. The DNA results were back. I told her. Knew I the truth about Owen. I told her. I knew exactly who his father was. Her face didn't just pale. It turned the color of ash.
Feed.
She started talking, her voice, a frantic, high-pitched blur. She could explain it. Wasn't lint. What I thought we could fix this. And then she whispered the words that finally broke the last thread of my pity for her.
Wouldn't tell anyone.
That stopped me dead in my tracks. You're not scared of losing me, I asked, my voice dangerously calm. You're only scared that people will finally know who you are.
Be that.
She opened her mouth, closed it, and had nothing left to say. I stood up, towering over the ruins of my marriage. I told her my lawyer would be in touch with the papers. She had 30 days to vacate my house.
Single thing was missing or damaged, I would come for her with everything the law allowed. Dot.
She began to sob, clutching at me, saying she never meant for things to end like this, that she still cared for me.
Fusion.
I looked down at her and felt nothing. Her feelings were no longer my problem. She had made her bed, and now she would learn to lie in it. Lucas and I walked out the door and into the cool air.
Fune once up.
We didn't say a word in the car, and we didn't need to. That night, I called Patterson and gave him the order to file it all. Justice was finally on its way. The weight of her emotions was no longer a burden I carried.
Bro.
She had paved her own path with the choices she made, and now she would have to walk it alone. Lucas and I walked out of that house in a silence, so thick it felt tangible.
Conversation.
Was necessary. The betrayal was already written in the air between us. That very night, I reached out to Patterson and gave him the order to initiate everything.
Divorce charges of paternity fraud.
And the immediate removal of my name from that birth certificate. The full weight of the legal hammer was coming down.
Feed.
Patterson offered a grave warning that this would turn into a bloodbath of litigation. Vanessa would fight tooth and nail, and my father was bound to crawl out of the woodwork to interfere.
Thing.
I looked him dead in the eye and told him I didn't care how messy it got. I wasn't the one who had spent 3 years living a lie, so I had nothing to fear from the truth.
Thing.
Patterson promised he would have the mountain of documents ready for filing by week's end. The first person to show a crack in their armor wasn't Vanessa, but her sidekick Betty.
I had confronted Vanessa about the reality of Owen's heritage.
Betty appeared at my mother's house. I have no idea how she managed to track down that address. And frankly, I didn't care.
At 8 in the morning, Pull showed up at 8 in the morning, putting on a sickening display of feigned concern.
She claimed she just wanted to check on me, insisting that Vanessa was worried and suggesting we all sit down like civilized people.
Fabian,
My mother called me immediately, her voice steady, asking if I wanted her to handle the intrusion. I told her yes, and I heard the satisfaction in her voice as she hung up to deal with the guest. She marched outside and told Betty on certain terms that her presence was no longer welcome. She made it clear that this was family business and that Betty had never been and would never be family.
Uzub,
She warned her that if she stepped foot on the property again, it would be met with charges of harassment. Betty tried one last time to pull the sympathy card, rambling about Vanessa's struggle and how everyone makes mistakes.
Ichu,
My mother cut her off, stating that Vanessa could struggle with her poor choices on her own time, but she needed to leave my property immediately. Betty left, but the spiteful nature of her character shone through an hour later. He posted a vague, pathetic status on social media about toxic families holding grudges and the sanctity of supporting friends. I took screenshots of every word, saved them, and waited.
Vanessa had finally dropped
The perfect wife mask and shifted into a full-blown victimrent mode. She talked about betrayal, about personal growth, and about standing in your truth.
Use.
And of course, Betty was right there in the comments, cheering her on like a loyal soldier. Own your story, they wrote. They can't handle your power while the world looked on.
Him.
Lucas pointed out that every single one of those posts was just more evidence for the pile. Patterson confirmed that he had already begun archiving her entire social media feed.
Fees up.
Then, my father tried to insert himself into the narrative with his own brand of cowardice. But he showed up at my office, and the reception desk called up to tell me he was waiting in the lobby.
Unig.
I told them to send him packing, as I no longer had a father in my life. An hour later, he sent an email, a long, winding mess of nonsense about how he never intended to cause me pain.
Venif.
He talked about how emotions aren't always convenient, and how blood is supposedly thicker than water. I forwarded the entire pathetic document to Patterson without even bothering to reply.
Usine.
The very next morning, the divorce papers were served to Vanessa by a formal courier. They were clean, cold, and legally absolute. Patterson had included everything:
Fusion.
the adultery, the paternity fraud, and a strict notice to vacate the premises within 30 days. He also attached the deed, showing I was the sole owner of the property and the prenup that protected my premarital assets.
Finby.
16 times that day, leaving 11 voicemails, each one more frantic and unhinged than the last. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked. "My lawyer says this isn't legal. You're destroying our family."
Figs.
I didn't answer. A single one. I just saved them all as proof of her desperation. That night, my cousin Julie called, her voice full of genuine concern.
Vint.
She and I had always been close, and she said the family grapevine was working overtime with rumors. I gave her the short, painful version of the truth.
You.
She told me that if I needed a place to hide or a shoulder to lean on, she was there. 3 days later, the entire tide turned in our favor.
You get.
One of Betty's own friends from their private group chat, a woman I had never even met, reached out to Lucas. She had been in the chat when Betty accidentally posted a screenshot of their strategy session.
Thinks you.
Betty had deleted it within minutes, but this woman had seen the red flags and grabbed a copy first. She sent Lucas the full damning image. The screenshot was everything I had dared to hope for and more.
Finkson.
It was Betty and Vanessa planning exactly how to spin the narrative to paint me as the villain. They discussed what to post, who to contact, and how to make me appear unstable to everyone we knew. Betty had written, "Get ahead of this post about emotional abuse, plant the seeds early." Vanessa had asked, "What about the paternity thing?" And Betty had replied that never goes public, keep it vague. Lucas sent the files to me, and I sent them directly to Patterson. Patterson called me within the hour, his voice buzzing with excitement.
You.
"This is gold," he said. "This is proof of collusion, deceit, and manipulation that will hold up in every single hearing." Betty had no idea we held the smoking gun.
He was still busy
Playing the loyal best friend in the comment sections of Vanessa's posts. Patterson waited almost a week before he decided to spring the trap, letting Betty continue to chirp while she dug her own grave.
Thanks.
Then he sent her lawyer a letter. It wasn't about the screenshot. It was a polite, devastating summary of her civil liability for interference with my marriage.
Feuds.
He mentioned the coaching of deception and the high probability of a subpoena for her digital records. The very next day, Betty's lawyer called Patterson, his tone significantly less arrogant than before.
You.
Betty wanted to cooperate, claiming she had been manipulated by Vanessa and that she had only wanted to help a friend in need. Over the next few days, her lawyer sent over a cooperation statement filled with excuses.
Feud.
Once Patterson had her pathetic story in writing, he finally sent her lawyer the screenshot we had been holding. The reaction was immediate and absolute silence.
Fusey.
It was a long, heavy silence followed by a defeat to revise our position. The next day, a new statement arrived, and this time it was the raw, unvarnished truth. Yes, she had known the truth about Owen.
He had strategized every move.
Yes, she had coached Vanessa on how to hide the paternity issue while painting me as the aggressor.
Fanny.
The full collapse of her ego took nearly 2 weeks, but watching her scramble to save herself was worth every second. I told Patterson to hold on to everything. Betty had never cared about anyone but herself.
It.
Meanwhile, Vanessa posted a final polished growth statement. It was full of buzzwords about mistakes healing and protecting her son, but zero accountability. I didn't bother responding to her public circus.
X.
Instead, I wrote one simple factual paragraph and sent it to every member of our family. I laid it out. Vanessa had engaged in an affair with my own father. The paternity testing had confirmed that Owen was not my son. Divorce proceedings were finalized, and all questions should be directed to my attorney. I sent it to my mother, my aunts, my uncles, and my cousins.
I turned my phone off
and went to the gym to let the adrenaline work its way out. Lucas texted me later that evening telling me my mom had handled it with quiet, devastating efficiency.
Bang same.
The response from the family was overwhelmingly in my favor, and the truth had cleansed the air. My father had already been uninvited from every upcoming gathering, though some still clung to their delusions.
Victim.
2 days later, my Uncle Rich, my father's younger brother, arrived at my office insisting on a talk. I allowed him into my office, and he sat down to launch into a sanctimonious speech about family privacy.
Using.
He talked about the virtue of forgiveness and how I was the one tearing the family apart by speaking the truth. He claimed my mother was being too harsh and that I needed to show maturity by sweeping this under the rug.
Thing.
Sat there, letting him finish his entire pathetic monologue, my face completely neutral. I looked at him, feeling the weight of the last few months finally lifting and prepared to deliver the final blow. I sat there, watching him speak, my hands folded tightly in my lap to stop them from shaking.
He was lecturing me again,
weaving a tapestry of family privacy and forgiveness as if he hadn't just shattered the foundations of my entire existence.
Thing.
He spoke about how I was the one tearing the family apart, claiming that my mother was being too harsh and that I as a man needed to show more maturity. I didn't say a word.
Thinged.
I just watched his lips move, realizing that for the first time in my life, I could see the strings attached to his every word.
Thicked.
When he finally paused, waiting for my submission, I simply stood up, walked to the door, and swung it wide open.
Privacy is for families, I said.
My voice cold as ice. I'm done protecting yours.
Feud.
He tried one last attempt to condescend, muttering about how I was too young to understand the complexity of the situation. I didn't argue.
Few.
I just stood by the door staring at him until the silence became heavy enough to suffocate him. He left, but the war was far from over.
Speak.
That weekend, Vanessa, my soon-to-be ex-wife, showed up at the apartment where I'd been staying with my friend Lucas.
He was banging on
the door, sobbing, claiming that Betty had given her terrible advice and that she just wanted to fix things. Lucas opened the door, looked at her with pure disdain, and didn't even invite her in.
We are discussing paternity fraud and adultery,
he said, his voice flat.
We aren't discussing your feelings.
He slammed the door in her face. She stood outside wailing for 10 minutes, waiting for me to crack. I didn't move.
Few.
Lucas turned to me and said, "She's not crying because she's sorry. She's crying because she knows she's losing." By the end of the month, Vanessa had cleared out her belongings.
She didn't trash the place, but she took everything of value. Dot.
I changed the locks the moment her car pulled out of the driveway. My attorney Patterson informed me that our first hearing was scheduled within 8 weeks.
Reasons.
Vanessa's legal team was already aggressive, pushing for massive alimony and child support while simultaneously fighting to contest the paternity test. Dot used everything I told him.
Vainsio.
Every screenshot, every timestamp, every conversation. In court, her lawyer tried to have the results tossed, claiming I had obtained the samples without proper consent,
Stood there.
pointing at me, arguing that Owen the boy I had raised as my son deserved stability and that removing me as his legal father would be a trauma he couldn't recover from. Patterson didn't raise his voice.
He simply dismantled them.
He proved. The samples were legally obtained, and that Vanessa had been committing fraud for 3 years. Owen has a right to know his true origin. Patterson argued, his voice echoing in the courtroom. A stability built on a foundation of lies is nothing more than a ticking time bomb. The judge agreed, ordering a court-mandated second test. The result remained the same, 0%, but the battle took a strange, dark turn.
Fangs.
The judge raised the issue of equitable estoppel legal doctrine, suggesting that, because I had acted as a father for 3 years, I might still be on the hook for support regardless of the biology.
Felt like the world was collapsing again.
Dot. Vanessa's lawyer jumped on it, arguing that the bond I had with Owen was the only thing that mattered. Dot. Patterson, however, played our ace. He filed a mountain of evidence.
Fair. Timeline.
The explicit messages between Vanessa and my father, and the coordination with Betty to keep the lie alive. He argued that fraud voids everything. He showed the court how Vanessa hadn't confessed but had been caught red-handed. My name was ordered off the birth certificate. My legal obligations were terminated. The judge made it clear. The ruling was based entirely on the depth of Vanessa's deception. Vanessa tried to cry in court, begging for fairness, but the judge didn't deal in tears, she dealt in facts. You created this tragedy, the judge told her.
You cannot demand support from a man you systematically betrayed. My father,
the man who had orchestrated this betrayal by sleeping with his own son's wife, didn't show his face at a single hearing. He let her drown alone.
Fair.
A week later, he tried to buy his way out. His lawyer sent an offer, $25,000 for a signed NDA.
Dot.
Complete silence. No mention of the affair, no mention of the fraud, no contact with the family. Patterson read the offer to me and asked what I wanted to do. I laughed a sharp, bitter sound. Tell him the truth. Isn't for sale, I replied. Patterson smiled and tucked the offer away. This is now evidence of guilt, he noted.
If he tries anything else, we have him by the throat.
Meanwhile, my mother was a rock. She didn't need drama, she just told the truth.
He cheated on me.
He gaslit me, and now he's done it to his own son. She would tell anyone who asked. People believed her because they had seen him do it before. When my aunt bumped into him at the market, she didn't mince words.
Bessie, you are a coward, she said, cutting him off mid-excuse.
There is nothing complicated about destroying your own family for a moment of pleasure. Within weeks, he was a pariah. Read it? He was uninvited from every holiday, every birthday, every gathering. But he wasn't done. He made one last move, a desperate attempt to ruin my career. He called one of my biggest clients posing as a concerned family member,
for suggesting I was having a mental breakdown
and that my work might be suffering. The client called me directly, confused by the call. I remained calm. My father and I are estranged. I told him, keeping my tone professional.
He is doing this to hurt me.
My work speaks for itself. The client apologized, admitting the call felt off. I sat in my office stunned by the sheer level of malice.
Wasn't
just an affair. This was an attempt to control me even as his own world burned down. I called Patterson again. We sent a cease and desist letter that afternoon with a warning that any further interference would result in a lawsuit for tortious interference. Dot! He went silent after that. Vanessa's online life, once a parade of perfect photos.
Usual.
had devolved into posts about single motherhood and adversity, with Betty still cheering her on in the comments. They could have their fake lives. I had my truth. For the first time in 3 years, I could finally breathe. The air in the sterile conference room was thick with the weight of things left unsaid. Vanessa's curated online persona had completely collapsed under the crushing reality of her own making. Gone was the influencer life, the filtered perfection, and the staged happiness.
Dang it.
Her recent posts were desperate, messy attempts to garner sympathy through tales of struggle, single motherhood, and unearned adversity.
Vent.
Betty, ever the loyal sidekick, hovered in the comments section attempting to gaslight the public into believing Vanessa was the victim, but nobody was buying the narrative anymore.
Fusion.
The public had seen the screenshots, the timestamps, and the cold, hard proof of her betrayal. Within a week of the backlash, she had locked her accounts, retreating into a silence that felt like a burial.
Fiend.
7 months after I filed for divorce, the legal battle finally reached its conclusion. Vanessa had dragged her feet, filing endless, pointless motions, desperately clinging to the hope that she could stay in my house.
Thing.
Patterson, my lawyer, dismantled every single one of her attempts with a clinical precision that bordered on art.
Dot.
In the final settlement, she walked away with nothing.
No alimony. No leverage, only the consequences of her own choices.
Soon after, my father reached out one last time.
He sent a letter filled with platitudes about blood being thicker than mistakes, hoping we could reconcile.
I read the letter, once felt nothing but a cold, detached clarity, and then burned it in the fireplace.
Beast.
I sent one final message to his number. You stopped being my father. The moment you decided to sleep with my wife.
Blood
means nothing when it's poisoned. Then I blocked every single line of communication he had.
You bet.
Lucas asked if I felt guilty for severing ties so completely, but I told him the truth. Guilt is a luxury for those who still care. And I didn't care anymore. Months later, I met Rachel.
Phew.
She was a project manager at one of our manufacturing clients, a woman who lived in the real world rather than on a screen. She was smart, funny, and refreshingly devoid of drama.
Fence.
We took our time building something quiet and stable, away from the wreckage of my past. Midhaunt, when I finally told her the truth about Vanessa and my father, she didn't flinch. She simply looked at me, acknowledged the baggage, and chose to stay. Meanwhile, my life began to resemble a home again.
Promoted.
My work life flourished, and my house felt like a sanctuary rather than a museum of mistakes. Yet there were ghosts. Owen remained a constant, silent presence in my heart.
You.
I would see children his age at the park, and my chest would tighten with a grief that never quite faded. Some nights I would lie awake, remembering the way he laughed at my dinosaur impressions.
Fiend.
The way he squeezed my hand and the phantom weight of him in my arms. Rachel was patient, even when she realized that my grief for my son was a room she couldn't fully enter.
He asked me once if I would ever try to see him. And
I told her the truth. He deserved better than to be a pawn in his mother's web of lies. Maybe when he was old enough to discern the truth, we could find a way.
Fiend, but not now.
Not while his foundation was built on sand. By the following spring, I proposed to Rachel in the quiet of our patio.
He said yes.
And for the first time in years, the future felt like a promise rather than a threat. But, just as we began to plan, the past decided to claw its way back into our lives.
Use up Reddit.
Vanessa reached out not through social media but through Patterson. She wanted closure. She wanted a meeting.
Patterson warned me.
But my curiosity, or perhaps my need for a final definitive period at the end of this sentence, won out. I told him to set it up.
You.
Before the meeting, Vanessa tried to poison the well once more by messaging Rachel, claiming I had manipulated the narrative. Rachel showed me the message, laughed, and blocked her without a word. The meeting took place on a rainy Saturday in Patterson's conference room. Vanessa looked a ghost of her former self, hair shorter. No makeup, eyes hollowed out by her own choices.
Thanked.
My father looked even worse, grayer, thinner, a man who had finally realized that his betrayal had cost him his only son. Patterson established the ground rules. 30 minutes, no negotiations, no counseling.
Finked.
Vanessa went first, her voice shaking as she claimed she was working on herself, that she was sorry. I didn't blink. Then my father started to speak, his voice cracking as he admitted to his terrible choices.
Fainting.
I looked at him, and for the first time I didn't see a father. I saw a stranger who had traded his integrity for a moment of weakness. Is that all? I asked, my voice steady, cutting through his excuses like a blade.
Fuse.
They looked stunned that I had no tears to shed, no arguments to make. I came here to tell you that you are both dead to me, I said, standing up. Not because I'm angry, but because I've already moved on.
Fact.
I walked out of the room, leaving them in the silence they had created for themselves. I didn't look back. The door closed, and this time it stayed shut forever.
Being set.
I walked out to the lobby, where Rachel was waiting, her hand reaching out for mine. I took it, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely unshakably free.
Justice I wanted.
Wasn't an apology. It was the ability to walk away fully whole without them ever being able to touch me again.
Thing.
And that I realized. As we stepped out into the sunlight was the only closure I had ever really needed. Dot. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the scent of stale coffee and the suffocating silence of 3 years of deception.
Fashion.
I stared at the two people sitting across from me, their faces etched with the kind of performative sorrow that usually precedes a request for money, not a plea for redemption.
Fecals.
Vanessa looked older, her once vibrant eyes dulled by the weight of her own choices. My father sat beside her, his posture rigid, his gaze fixated on a water stain on the table.
Yusef.
He had always been the man who controlled every room he entered, but today he looked small. Vanessa began, her voice barely a whisper, speaking of regrets and the desperate hope that I had found some semblance of peace.
Each night.
I didn't utter a word. I just watched, letting her shallow apology hang in the air like a rotting branch. Then my father spoke, his voice trembling with a rehearsed sincerity that made my skin crawl.
Fest.
To his betrayals, claiming he lived with the burden of his actions every single day.
Dot.
Again, I remained a statue of indifference.
Ticking clock on the wall.
Seemed to scream, highlighting the seconds they wasted, waiting for me to absolve them.
Dot.
When the silence finally became unbearable, I leaned forward, my voice calm, cold, and final.
Not here for closure.
I began, my eyes locking onto Vanessa's. I found my closure the moment the judge signed our divorce papers. Vanessa reached out, perhaps to touch my hand, but I pulled away.
Be clear about what happened here.
I said, my voice rising just enough to cut through the stillness. Dot. Vanessa, you didn't just cheat. You committed paternity fraud.
Fiend.
The color drained from her face as I laid out the wreckage of my lengthy, sleepless nights. The diapers, the years of believing a boy who wasn't mine was my legacy.
View this.
Because you were confused, I continued, my gaze sharpening. You did it because it was convenient to have a husband who worked hard and didn't ask questions.
I turned my focus to my father.
The man who had taught me about honor while he was actively dismantling my life.
And you? Dot.
I said, his head snapping up to meet my icy stare. You didn't just betray me, you tried to erase me.
Face it.
I reminded him of the times he sat in my living room, offering advice on parenting, while he knew the child I was raising was his own blood. I brought up the phone calls to my clients, the subtle sabotage of my career.
Think.
The way he had tried to paint me as unstable when I started asking the right questions. He flinched, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his face. You talk about the weight you carry? I scoffed.
Buried that weight for months while you played house.
I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor.
Bend.
I don't hate you. And I don't forgive you, I said, looking down at them as if they were strangers I had just met in a waiting room. I simply don't care anymore.
They read it.
I told them that if they ever reached out again, if they dared to darken my doorstep, or if they pulled our mutual friends into their web of lies, I would ensure the law responded on my behalf.
You.
I turned to Patterson, my attorney, and gave a slight nod. We walked out the door, closing behind us with a satisfying final click. The drive back with Lucas was quiet, a comfortable silence that felt like healing.
Thing.
Rachel was waiting for me at home, her smile, the only beacon of reality I needed in a world that had felt like a fever dream.
Feud.
Months bled into a blur of progress, a new project at work, the steady rhythm of planning a future, with a woman who actually looked me in the eye when she spoke.
You.
About a year and a half later, a call from Julie confirmed the inevitable collapse. Vanessa and my father's house of cards had finally imploded. Used to commit to her. She exploded in public, and the resulting drama was as messy and pathetic as I had expected.
Etib.
They had built a life on the foundation of lying to me. It was only a matter of time before they began lying to each other. The following spring, Rachel and I were married on a crisp Saturday in April.
Fat.
The ceremony was small, intimate, and entirely authentic. My mother walked me down the aisle, her presence a stark contrast to the man who should have been standing there.
View.
During the reception, as the glasses clinked and the laughter filled the room, I stood up to address our guests.
Fen.
I looked at the people around me, friends who had stood by me when I had nothing but a broken heart and a pile of legal fees.
Family.
Isn't defined by blood, I said, my voice steady.
Feel.
It is defined by who shows up when you are at your lowest. I spoke about the choice to walk away, to stop trying to please people who saw me as an inconvenience.
Things.
I thanked them for helping me build something real, something that didn't require a mask. The best revenge once making them suffer. I realized then it was living a life that didn't have room for them in it.
Viewed it.
That night, in the quiet of our hotel room, Rachel asked if I had given them a single thought throughout the day. I looked at the woman. I loved the woman who had helped me find my own truth.
Thing.
I said. And for the first time in my life, I knew it was the absolute truth. The glass in my hand felt cool, a stark contrast to the burning intensity of the memories that had haunted me for years.
Thinged.
Around me, the room was filled with the hum of genuine laughter and the clinking of silverware, a sound that finally felt like home.
Fence.
Rachel leaned in her eyes, reflecting the warmth of the candles, and pressed a soft kiss to my cheek. We did it, she whispered, her voice a soothing balm over the jagged edges of my past.
Beijing.
Everyone raised their glasses in a toast, the clatter of crystal ringing out like a victory bell for a life reclaimed.
Pent.
Later that night, as we sat in the quiet luxury of our hotel room, the city lights shimmering like fallen stars below us, Rachel turned to me.
Tell me the truth.
She asked, her gaze steady and searching. Did you think about them at all today? I took a long breath, letting the weight of the last 4 years settle before finally letting it go.
Finn.
Not once, I said, and for the first time it wasn't a lie. 4 years ago, I had walked into what I thought was the sanctuary of my bedroom, only to have my entire world disintegrate. The sight of my wife, Vanessa, and my own father, Patterson, together in our bed, was a horror that no amount of time could ever truly erase.
Fixed in.
The betrayal cut deeper than the infidelity. It was the discovery that the little boy I had been raising, the child I adored, was not mine by blood.
Fen.
Everything I had believed in, every promise, every whispered, I love you, had been a cold, calculated fabrication.
Thinked.
Vanessa and my father had built a palace of lies, expecting me to stay trapped in their version of reality while they danced on the ruins of my dignity.
Easy.
They had tried to break me, to force me into a life of complicity and silence, thinking I was weak enough to accept their twisted script. But they had failed.
Failed.
They had failed because I unleashed a storm of rage or fought them with the same venom they used against me.
Failed them.
Because I simply walked away, turning my back on the toxicity and refusing to give them the reaction they craved. I chose to vanish from their orbit, stripping them of the power they thought they held over my soul.
Soul. Faction.
I rebuilt brick by brick, piece by piece, creating something better, something honest, and something that finally belonged to me.
Finch.
I met Rach Shelyul, who taught me that loyalty isn't demanded, it's earned through the quiet consistency of being there. We moved into a house that held no shadows of the past, filled with people who valued integrity over manipulation.
Full.
I looked at my life. Now the peace. The stability, the genuine affection. I realized the true cost of their betrayal was their own loss of me. They chose their path of deceit, and I chose the path of liberation.
Future.
My life as it stands today is infinitely better than anything they could have ever imagined for me. The silence of my past has been replaced by the music of a future I actually want to live in.
Beam Booth.
It was never about revenge. It was about the simple, profound act of letting go of what wasn't meant to be. But the scars remain, but they are no longer bleeding, they are just quiet reminders of how far I have come.
Phasia.
I looked over at Rachel, who was drifting off to sleep, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that led us here.
Phasing.
The ghost of the man I used to be, one, who was constantly looking over his shoulder, has finally been laid to rest. I am finally truly living for myself.
For the first time.
In a long time, the only thing on my mind is the happiness of tomorrow. The end of the old story was just the beginning of a life worth living.
Huge.
Guys, we are standing on the edge of something incredible, so close to hitting that 1,000 thou as an subscriber milestone on this channel. If you haven't joined our community yet, please consider hitting that subscribe button today.
Emem.
It makes a massive difference in helping us reach our goal and continue sharing these stories. Thank you so much for being a part of this dream and for walking this path with me.
Feasted.
All right, Reddit. Grab some popcorn and strap in. This is going to be intense.
My name's Cole.
30 years old and am a journeyman lineman for the Regional Power Company, if you don't know what that means.
Freezing.
I'm the guy who climbs 40-foot poles in the middle of a freezing ice storm just to get your lights back on. I'm the guy who pulls 16-hour shifts during hurricanes while everyone else is frantically evacuating.
I'm the guy
Who makes sure the hospitals don't go dark and grandma's oxygen machine keeps pumping through the night. It's not a glamorous life. The hours are brutal and the conditions are downright dangerous. But it pays well.
Huge.
Good at it.
I've been doing this for 8 years now.
I grew up in a small town about 2 hours north of here. My dad was a mechanic who worked on heavy diesel engines until his back finally gave out.
You.
My mom was an ER nurse who worked the night shift so she could be home when we got off school. They taught me that you judge a man by what he does, not by what he says. Show up. Work hard. Keep your word.
Complain.
Fix what's broken. I took that advice to heart. By 28, I owned my house outright, paid in cash. 3 bedrooms, a decent yard, and a detached garage where I rebuilt motorcycles on the weekends.
Zero debt.
A solid retirement account, and enough savings to weather a year without working. Then I met Blair. She was 26 when we crossed paths at a mutual friend's cookout. She was beautiful without even trying.
Pruned hair.
Piercing green eyes, and a laugh that made you want to keep saying stupid things just to hear it again. She worked as an events coordinator for a boutique hotel downtown,
Things.
planning corporate retreats and wedding receptions. She had that polished, professional vibe going on. We talked for 3 hours that first night, standing by the fire pit, while everyone else got loud and distracted.
For her number.
She gave it to me without playing any games. I really liked that. It seemed like she had her head on straight.
Nicewood.
What I didn't know was that she was 6 months out of a 2-year relationship with a guy named Preston. Preston was the kind of guy who wore expensive boat shoes without socks and talked incessantly about his personal brand. He came from old money, worked at his daddy's investment firm, and treated women like accessories to be swapped out when he got bored. He cheated on Blair repeatedly, gaslit her whenever she confronted him,
Fixed.
and eventually dumped her when she demanded accountability, telling her she was too needy and too dramatic. He said she wasn't sophisticated enough for his circle.
Fenchy.
The breakup wrecked her confidence and left her finances in ruins. Because she'd been covering his expensive lifestyle while he pocketed his trust fund distributions. Blair was a total mess when I met her, but she hid it well.
Underneath that put-together
Exterior was a woman with maxed out credit cards totaling about $19,000, a car payment she could barely make, and a self-esteem that had been stomped flat by a guy with a Napoleon complex.
ease.
She was living in a cramped studio apartment she could barely afford, trying to look successful while drowning in debt. I didn't know any of that at first. I just knew I liked her. And apparently, she liked me too.
Fend.
Or at least, she liked what I could do for her. Our first year together was great. Really great. She seemed genuinely into me. She'd come to my house on weekends and watch me work on bikes in the garage,
Being.
asking questions about the engines, even though I could tell she didn't care about motorcycles. She'd pack me lunches when I had early shifts with little notes tucked inside. She met my parents and charmed them completely.
Fingson.
My mom loved her, and my dad said she seemed like good people. I trusted their judgment. When she finally told me about her debt about 3 months into the relationship, I didn't run. I didn't judge her.
Fenston.
I sat down with her at my kitchen table and made a plan. I paid off her credit cards in one shot, refinanced her car loan into my name to get her a better rate since her credit was trashed,
From.
and helped her build a budget that actually worked. Within 8 months, she was debt-free for the first time in her adult life. I didn't hold it over her. That's not why I did it.
Feason.
I did it because I loved her and I wanted us to have a solid foundation. When you're building something together, you don't keep score at least. That's what I thought. After a year of dating, she moved into my house.
Fence.
Her lease was up, I had the space, and she was spending most nights at my place anyway. She gave up her studio, packed her things into my truck and moved in. She didn't pay rent. I didn't ask her to.
Fusen.
The house was paid off. What was I going to do? Charge her to live with me? She covered groceries sometimes, split the utilities, and handled the streaming subscription since I didn't care about that stuff.
It worked. 6 months after she moved in.
I proposed on a hike to her favorite overlook at sunset. I carried that ring in my pocket for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. She cried, said yes,
You.
and told me I was everything she'd ever wanted. I thought I'd found my person. That's when things started to shift. The engagement seemed to flip a switch in Blair's brain.
First.
Little things I could explain away. She started caring more about the wedding than about us. Every conversation became about venues, flowers, color schemes, and seating charts.
Fend.
I'd come home from a 12-hour shift covered in mud and sweat, and she'd shove a tablet in my face, asking me to choose between two shades of white that looked identical to my exhausted eyes. I'd say they looked the same.
Fungston. And Shed.
Get frustrated, saying I wasn't taking this seriously. The wedding planning kicked into high gear about 2 months after the engagement.
Fagged.
Blair found a venue. She loved some converted barn outside the city that charged more per hour than I made in a week. I told her we should look at some other options, maybe something more within our budget.
When the max started to slip.
She looked at me like I was a stranger. She told me that her dream day shouldn't be compromised because of my blue-collar salary. I was stunned.
Being.
I had provided the home she lived in and the freedom from debt she enjoyed, but suddenly, I was the one holding her back. Then came the wedding invitations. She was planning a small private ceremony, or so she told me.
Voodoo.
But then I found out she was sending invites to people. ID never met friends from her old life, coworkers, even some of the people who knew Preston. When I asked her about it, she got defensive.
Feud.
She said, I wouldn't understand the social obligations of her career. The final straw came a week ago. One of her friends was getting married, and I asked her if we were going. She looked at me, cold as ice, and said,
Friends, think. You're a downgrade from my ex. It's better if you stay home.
I just nodded, feeling a strange, hollow silence settle in my chest. When she left, I didn't argue. I simply canceled everything.
Fold.
The venue, the caterer, the photographer, all the deposits I had paid with my own money. I retracted. Then, I packed every single one of her things. I put her clothes, her books,
View.
her trinkets into boxes, and set them on the curb. A few hours later, her mom called me, screaming about how I was a monster for ruining her daughter's big day and humiliating her by putting her stuff out.
Thinked.
I listened to her rant for a minute. Then I said, Ma'am, your daughter called me a downgrade. She's the one who decided she wanted to be someone I couldn't provide for. I hung up, blocked her number,
You.
and walked into my garage to work on my bike. I'm alone tonight, but for the first time in a long time, the house feels quiet and mine again. I paid for my peace, and I think it's the best money I've ever spent.
All right, Reddit. Fent.
Grab your coffee. This story is a long time coming, and honestly, it's about time I put it all out there. My name is Cole, and for the longest time, I thought I was building a life with the woman of my dreams.
Ease.
But, as it turns out, I was just a character in a play. I didn't know I was starring in, written by people who wanted me off the stage. It all started when the wedding planning went into high gear about 2 months after the proposal.
Frunkstez.
Blair found a venue she absolutely adored. It was some converted barn outside the city that charged more per hour than I made in an entire week of hard, dangerous work. We put down a $5,000 deposit money.
Vigner.
I had worked overtime for her parents, Gerald and Meredith, matched it because they insisted on contributing. Gerald, her dad, seemed genuinely happy to chip in. Meredith, however,
Filzen.
acted like she was doing us a massive favor just by letting her money touch our peasant wedding. The caterer, the florist, and the photographer followed in quick succession. Her parents covered about $8,000 total.
Covered every single cent of the rest.
We set the date for the following spring, 10 months out, and for a moment, I thought we were actually building a foundation. Then her friends got involved. Specifically,
I came.
to call the Poison Twins, Kendall and Aubrey. They been Blairs, friends since college, part of some sorority sisterhood that apparently created bonds and strong common sense or basic human decency. They hated me from day one, and they didn't bother hiding it behind fake smiles. Kendall was a real estate agent who sold overpriced, hollow condos to tech bros and honestly believed that made her a mogul.
BMW that was definitely leased and dressed.
Like she was perpetually on her way to a yacht party that didn't exist. Aubrey worked in pharmaceutical sales and had the personality of a root canal. Fake as anything.
Feed. And twice as painful.
The first time I met them at some overpriced lounge. Downtown, Kendall looked me up and down like a piece of dirt on her shoe. So, you're the electrician Blair's been talking about? She asked, her voice dripping with condescension. I corrected her calmly, stating I was actually a lineman. She let out this high-pitched, screeching laugh that made my skin crawl and said, "Same thing, right?"
You both just play with wires.
I let it go, because Blair was sitting right there, and I didn't want to cause a scene. Looking back, I should have burned that bridge down right then and there.
Fission.
I should have told Kendall that the difference between a lineman and an electrician is like the difference between a real estate agent and someone who actually builds the houses they sell. But I kept my mouth shut.
Yushi.
I tried to be the bigger person. That was my first major mistake. Over the next few months, those two worked on Blair like termites on a wooden foundation.
Ekem.
Every time she came back from brunch with them, and there was always brunch, she was a little more distant, a little more critical, a little more focused on what I didn't have instead of what I was giving. She started making backhanded comments about my job. She asked if I had ever thought about moving into management, something with normal office hours and clean clothes. I told her. I liked what I did. I was good at it.
And the union pension was rock solid.
Shed just sigh and say she knew.
Fingshi.
But that it would be nice to have a husband who didn't smell like transformer oil and come home looking like he'd lost a fight with a mud pit. Then came the comparisons. Shed mentioned how Kendall's boyfriend just made partner at his law firm, how Aubrey's fiancé was taking her to Santorini for their engagement photos. And then there was Preston. Oh yeah, she started bringing him up again.
Preston
just bought a condo downtown in that new building with the rooftop pool. Isn't that nice for him? Shed asked, her eyes gleaming with a strange expectation. I'd grunt and say good for him, but inside, I was keeping a tally of the cracks in our relationship. My buddy Deacon saw it happening long before I did. Deacon's been my best friend since high school worked summer jobs together, got into trouble together,
grew up together.
He's a welder now, owns his own fabrication shop, looks like a biker with the beard and the tattoos, but talks like a philosophy professor when he's had enough coffee.
Zero filter.
And had been skeptical of Blair from the start, calling her a fixer-upper when I first introduced them. But he kept his mouth shut because he respected my choices. Deacon met the Poison Twins exactly once. Made the mistake of organizing a dinner with both friend groups, thinking everyone would find common ground. Within 20 minutes, Kendall had asked Deacon what kind of car he drove. He said, "A truck," she asked.
Fix, what year?
He looked her dead in the eye, and said, "It runs." She didn't know what to do with that, so she just stared at her salad. Aubrey then tried to ask him about his investment strategy. Deacon just shrugged and said his strategy was not being broke. They stopped talking to him after that and spent the rest of the night whispering to Blair in corners. On the drive home, Deacon looked at me and said, "Man,
Finn, those two are going to be a problem. I told him they were harmless.
He shook his head and replied, "Nah, they're scorekeepers. Everything is as a competition to them. And right now,"
Fingshi.
looking at Blair and wondering why he's not winning. I didn't get what he meant at the time. Taught about 3 months before everything blew up, Deacon and I were fishing at his cabin up north.
One of those perfect October days where the air smells like wood smoke and the fish are actually biting.
We'd been out there since dawn, not talking much, just enjoying the quiet. Around noon, Deacon cracked open a drink, stared at the water for a long time, and finally said, "You know your girl's changing, right?" I sighed. "She's just stressing about the wedding. Everyone does." He shook his head slowly. "Nah, man.
Makes you tired. Snappy, maybe.
Whatever's going on with her is something else. She looks at you like you're a problem she's got to figure out instead of someone she actually wants to be with."
Enan.
I told him he was being paranoid and that he'd never liked her anyway. He cast his line out into the water and watched it sink. "I liked who she was when you met her," he said quietly. "But this version's got an audience."
Eadman.
I should have listened. I didn't. Fast forward to the day things finally imploded. Our mutual friends, Danielle and her fiancé, Trevor, were getting married at a fancy venue outside the city. Blair had been friends with Danielle since college, part of that same social circle that included the Poison twins. Known Trevor, through work, he was a line foreman who'd moved up to management a few years back.
Fidi.
He was a good guy, down to earth, and I was actually looking forward to the wedding. I thought it might be good for Blair and me to be around a happy couple and remind us what we were working toward. ID rented a nice
Tux saved.
scrubbed the grease from my fingernails for 3 days straight, and felt ready to show up for her. But when we arrived, I realized something was off. Blair wouldn't look at me. She kept checking her phone.
Glancing toward the entrance every 5 minutes.
Then I saw him, Preston. He walked in looking like he'd stepped out of a magazine ad, and suddenly the room felt much colder.
Face.
Lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. It wasn't just a friendly greeting, it was relief. She left my side without a word, walking over to him as if I were nothing more than a ghost. I stood there by the bar,
Everyth.
a drink in my hand, watching them talk. Kendall and Aubrey were hovering nearby, laughing and casting glances in my direction. It hit me then, not like a punch, but like a slow, freezing realization.
You wasn't a partner.
I was a placeholder. I was the guy you keep around until the upgraded version shows up. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't flip a table or scream. Instead, I walked over to the wedding planner,
Few.
found out where the gifts were being kept, and realized something even more sinister. I saw Blair whispering to the Poison twins, and I saw her pull out a small velvet box that definitely didn't contain my engagement ring.
He was returning my ring, the one it saved 6 months for to get something else.
I walked up to her, tapped her on the shoulder, and watched the color drain from her face. I didn't yell. I just leaned in and whispered,
Thinked.
"I think you've got someone else you need to be talking to." The look of pure, unadulterated shock on her face was almost worth the pain. But the real kicker, I had already handled the finances.
Fen.
I had contacted the caterer and the venue earlier that week, knowing something was wrong, and I had quietly moved the deposit refunds into a separate account under my name only. Her parents had contributed.
Fend.
But because of the legal contract it had drawn up for the venue, the money stayed with the primary signee. Me. As I walked out of that wedding, I didn't look back. I left her there, surrounded by her friends, that the man she thought was a lineman had just outplayed her entire game. I didn't just walk away from a bad relationship. I walked away with my dignity, my savings, and a hard-earned lesson. The Poison twins could keep their condoliving, yatched, dreaming, fake smiling life.
No.
I had my truck, my career, and for the first time in a long time, my peace. That night, I sat at Deacon's shop, drank a beer.
Finally understood what he meant.
I was never winning because I was playing a game. I wasn't meant to win. But the funny thing about life is, when you stop trying to keep up with people who don't respect you,
You weren't behind at all.
you were just on a different path entirely. Justice isn't always a dramatic shout sometimes. It's just the quiet sound of a door closing behind you
You knowledge.
that you're finally free. The next day, I got a text from Blair. Where did the money go? My parents are furious. I didn't even bother replying. I just blocked the number, blocked the twins,
Fear.
and went to work. The wire was humming, the sun was rising, and for the first time in years, the air didn't smell like a trap. It smelled like a new beginning. All right, Reddit, listen up. This is a story about how quickly the mask slips when you realize you're just a placeholder in someone else's social climbing game.
I'm Cole.
I spent 9 hours in a bucket truck during an ice storm,
Think.
struggling to restore power to a nursing home where the elderly were shivering in the dark. My hands were raw, I was dehydrated, and I was covered in 10 pounds of frozen grime and sweat,
Thing.
expecting nothing more than a hot shower and a bed. What I got instead was Blair sitting on the couch with that specific sharp look on her face, with one that usually signals a storm is coming.
Fission.
I dropped my heavy gear bag by the door, exhausted. I asked her what was wrong. She stared at Tammy, her face unreadable, and said we needed to talk. She started with the long,
Winding preamble.
the classic setup people use when they know they're about to drop a bomb. She talked about Daniel's wedding, the guest list, the venue capacity, and vague concerns from her friends about the vibe of the reception.
Frowned.
I didn't have a clue what she was getting at. I'd met her friends before, and they'd seemed perfectly fine. I told her to just get to the point. She took a shaky breath and looked away. Kendall and Aubrey, those two,
Things.
they thought it would be better if I didn't attend. It would be uncomfortable, she claimed. She added that Preston would be there, and it might be awkward. I stared at her for a long, silent moment.
Asked her why.
Preston's presence had anything to do with my attendance. She stumbled over her words, saying it was complicated. She claimed her social circle worried about tension,
Thinked.
suggesting Preston was a better fit for their group, and that it would be weird to have her fiancé around when everyone was so familiar with her ex. I kept my voice dangerously level.
Fainted.
I asked if her brilliant plan to avoid drama was to uninvite her own fiancé to a wedding just to keep her ex-boyfriend comfortable. She immediately went on the defensive, claiming I was twisting her words.
He insisted.
It wasn't about Preston, but about the group dynamic. She told me I wouldn't fit in, that I wouldn't have anything to talk about with the other guests, and frankly, she thought her friends were right.
Fact.
That was the moment the scale fell from my eyes. It wasn't about protecting my feelings. It was about her being deeply pathetically ashamed of me. I asked her point blank. Are you ashamed of me? She hesitated.
Then gave me the standard empty.
No, of course not. I told her that was interesting. She got snappy, asking if I was mad. I told her I wasn't mad, he was thankful, because she'd finally cleared the air.
He told me not to take it personally, which was the final straw.
I asked her how else I was supposed to take it when Shed just admitted she was embarrassed to be seen with her own fiancé. She started screaming that I was being dramatic, that I was twisting everything. Then the truth came out in a jagged, ugly burst. She yelled that Kendall said I was a downgrade from Preston, and Aubrey agreed. So yes,
He was embarrassed.
the silence that followed was absolute. She realized what Shed said and tried to walk it back, but the damage was irreversible. I told her I understood perfectly. She actually looked relieved, thinking I was just going to roll over and accept my role as her little shameful secret. She smiled weakly, saying she knew I was practical, and that's what she loved about me. I walked past her toward the bedroom.
That.
She followed me, her heels clicking on the hardwood, demanding to know what I was doing. I pulled a suitcase from the closet and started clearing her dresser drawers. She was losing her mind,
Phasen.
screaming about how I was overreacting. I stopped, set the suitcases down, and looked her in the eye. I told her she had until Thursday to leave. I told her ID put it in writing, and if she made it difficult,
fee.
the police would be there to handle the removal. She laughed in my face, telling me I couldn't kick her out because it was my house, her words, and she lived there.
Fake she.
Reminded her that she wasn't on the lease and had moved in as a guest, and now that invitation was revoked. The color drained from her face as she realized. I wasn't joking. She asked if I was breaking up with her.
Folder yes.
She started sobbing, calling me cruel and saying it was all a misunderstanding. I had zero patience left. I went to my desk, wrote a formal notice with the date and the Thursday deadline, signed it,
Think.
and handed it to her. She grabbed my arm, begging me to talk, but I pulled away. Right then, the front door opened, and Deacon walked in. He was there to return a torque wrench for our bike project.
You.
He took one look at her tears and my stone-cold expression and immediately understood the shift in gravity. He asked what he'd missed. I gave him the two-sentence version. Deacon looked at the paper in her hand and nodded. Thee was my witness now. For the next hour, Blair cycled through every tactic, begging, crying, bargaining, and finally threatening to call the cops.
Deacon just sat there.
And calmly told her she could call whoever she wanted. But the notice was legal, and the timeline was reasonable. She was desperate, so she called Kendall and put her on speaker. Kendall started screeching,
Thinked.
calling me a psycho and telling Blair to call the police immediately. I just watched them, feeling a strange sense of clarity. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and for the first time in months,
The air in my own house felt clean.
she thought she was the one in control, holding the cards of social status and proper expectations. She didn't realize that the moment she chose her friend's approval over her partner's dignity, he had already ended the relationship. I didn't need a shouting match. I had the law, I had a witness, and most importantly, I had my self-respect back. She spent that night in the guest room,
Fingin still.
thinking this was a negotiation. She thought that by morning I would soften, that the practical Cole would realize he couldn't live without her. She had no idea that I had already checked out of this relationship the moment she said the word. Downgrade. When Thursday came, she was still trying to play the victim, calling every mutual friend we had to twist the story.
Fenin.
But by then, I had already moved her remaining things to the porch. When the police did eventually show up, because she actually called them, they walked through the house, looked at the papers, and looked at me.
Feud.
They told her. She had 10 minutes to get off the property, and that if she returned, it would be trespassing. Watching the look on her face, as she realized her friends couldn't help her.
Ted
And her downgrade fiancé had finally grown a backbone, was worth more than any wedding I could have ever attended. Justice isn't always a dramatic explosion. Sometimes, justice is just a closed door, a silent house,
Kane.
and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you never have to be someone's secret again. She left. I changed the locks that afternoon. I still work on my bike with Deacon, and every time I turn a wrench.
Think about how glad I am that the power, quite literally, is back in my hands.
The silence in the living room was so heavy, it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Blair stood there, face twisted in a mask of indignation that didn't quite mask the flicker of panic in her eyes. She wasn't a tenant, she was my fiancée, but the dynamic had shifted into something cold and unrecognizable. Without a word,
She pulled out her phone and dialed Kendall.
she put the call on speaker, clearly looking for an audience, a reinforcement of her own twisted reality. Kendall's voice erupted from the tiny speaker.
Screeching about how
I was a textbook psycho, a man spinning out of control, she told Blair to call the police, to report me for abusive behavior, painting me as the villain in her carefully curated drama. Deacon,
Think.
who had been standing by the door like a silent sentinel, finally stepped forward. He reached out, took the phone firmly from Blair's trembling hand, and held it to his ear. His voice was steady, devoid of any heat, yet it carried the chilling finality of a closing coffin lid. Hey, this is Deacon, he said, his eyes locking onto Blair's. Shez got until Thursday to get her life out of this house. If you want to play hero,
Face it.
come. Pick her up yourself, otherwise. Stop the screaming. He ended the call before Kendall could utter another syllable and dropped the phone back onto the table. The ring sat on the bathroom counter, bent, a glittering symbol of a promise that had curdled months ago. I walked past Blair, grabbed the small velvet box, and returned to the room. This stays, Seiss said, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. The engagement is dead, and this ring goes back to the jeweler. She lunged for it, a desperate animal trying to reclaim a piece of her pride. I stepped back, keeping the box just out of her reach. $8,000. Healer, I reminded her. It's not yours anymore. You gave it to me. That makes it mine, she shrieked. I'm returning it tomorrow, I replied, my expression carved from stone. She called me a monster. Feel the sting of the insult. Deacon just shrugged, looking at her with a mix of pity and boredom. He gave you until Thursday. That's more than fair. She didn't sleep in the guest room. She spent the night pacing, until she finally called her parents. Gerald arrived at midnight, his face showing the deep, tired lines of a man who had seen too much. We spoke. Spoke for a few minutes. I laid out the truth. The betrayal, the uninvited guests. He didn't defend her. He didn't argue. He just looked exhausted and nodded. He helped her pack the SUV, his movements heavy and sad. Bing. Then they drove away into the dark. Over the next 2 days, she returned twice with her mother, Meredith, to scavenge the rest of her belongings. I stayed out of the way, a ghost in my own home, refusing to engage with their glares or their snide remarks. Meredith watched me like I was a virus, but I didn't say a word. I didn't offer an excuse. On the second day, Gerald approached me as they finished loading the final boxes. He kept his voice low, a secret shared between two men who understood the cost of a broken home. For what it's worth, he said quietly. I get it. Would have done the exact same thing. I nodded, unable to find the words to thank him for that singular moment of validation. He shook my hand, climbed into the car, and left me in the silence. By Thursday evening, the house was empty, and the air felt clearer, lighter somehow. Blair stood at the edge of my driveway, looking back with eyes full of spite. She told me I would regret this. Thanked that I had discarded my one chance at true happiness. I didn't answer. I didn't even blink. I just watched her drive away, closing the door on that chapter forever. Deacon came over that night, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped behind the horizon. He handed me a drink, a quiet celebration of the end of the war. You good? He asked, his voice steady. Yeah, I said, looking out at the yard. I'm actually good. Morning. I went to work, but not my usual job. I went to work on the wreckage of the wedding. I pulled up my list. The venue, the caterer, the florist, the DJ, the photographer. One by one, I called them. Think. My voice firm, as I explained the event was canceled. Most were professional and sympathetic, offering condolences for the situation. A few tried to push for a postponement, but I cut them off. There was nothing left to save. Foundation to build upon. I signed the digital cancellation forms and saved every confirmation email into a folder. The deposits her parents had paid. Gone, non-refundable. Feud. Zut. $8,000 turned into dust because their daughter couldn't keep her mouth shut. Meredith called me that afternoon, frantic and furious. I let it go to voicemail, then again, then a third time. Fields. When I finally picked up, her voice was a high-pitched weapon. She demanded to know how I could humiliate their family by canceling without consulting them. She talked about Gerald's overtime, their savings, family tradition. I listened to her excuses until she paused for breath. Ask your daughter why she agreed to uninvite me from my own wedding just to please her ex, I said. The line went dead quiet. Have a nice day, whispered, and hung up. She tried to call back 4 times before I finally blocked the number. Next was the car, the final tether to her influence. I texted her. The car is in my name. Thing until Friday to get your things out. She responded with a wall of text, a manifesto of blame that I didn't even open. Friday came. The car was still full of her belongings. Big scene. So I cleaned it out myself and listed it on Facebook Marketplace. By Saturday morning, I had 3 offers and was meeting a buyer in a grocery store parking lot. I signed over the title, deposited the check,
then paid off the remaining loan. But
then I did the thing that made Deacon nearly choke on his coffee. Our wedding website was still active, a digital shrine to a lie. Blair had designed it.
I owned the domain and the hosting.
I didn't delete it. I changed the elegant homepage banner to 2 words in bold block letters. Event canceled. No photos, no story, no directions.
You know Zinxie.
Just those 2 words glowing against a white background. Blatter had shared that link everywhere, from her work email signature to the group chats with her friends. Within 24 hours, the rumor mill was screaming.
Everyone who clicked that link was met with a cold, hard truth.
I didn't have to explain a thing, because the website did all the talking for me. The silence of my house was no longer empty, it was finally mine. The rumors started spreading like wildfire, and honestly, I just let the chaos run its course. Within 24 hours, Blair's entire circle was buzzing with questions. Every one of her friends reached out, demanding answers.
Fides.
And poor Blair found herself trapped in an endless cycle of explaining the unexplainable. Each time she opened her mouth to tell the story, she had to face the brutal reality that our engagement was officially dead. She struggled, trying to decide how much of the ugly truth she dared to reveal to the world. But Danielle had stumbled upon the truth long before anyone else. That same afternoon, just hours after I'd updated the website,
She texted me.
her tone urgent, asking if the rumors swirling around were actually true. I decided to keep it simple, giving her the raw, factual version without any added drama.
Ease.
I told her exactly how Blair had uninvited me from the wedding, all because Kendall and Aubrey decided I was a downgrade compared to Preston. I told her the truth, that Blair had stood by and agreed with them.
Me no choice but to call the whole thing off.
Danielle was absolutely horrified by the revelation. She's explained that Kendall had only offered to help with the guest list as a favor, and she had never once authorized anyone to cut my name from the list. She had genuinely assumed I was coming to celebrate with them. Trevor had been expecting my presence too. She sent a barrage of apologies, sounding truly devastated, and mentioned how she had always viewed Blair and me as the perfect couple. Then she dropped the hammer. She was going to have a serious conversation with Kendall at the rehearsal dinner.
Killed it.
As it turned out, that conversation happened right in front of every single guest. Trevor was feeding me the play-by-play through text messages in real time, painting a vivid picture of the disaster.
Species.
Danielle confronted Kendall in the middle of the room, demanding to know by what authority she had decided who was worthy of attending her wedding. Kendall tried to play the role of the innocent bystander,
Feason.
claiming she was just trying to help and assuming she was doing what Danielle wanted. Danielle wasn't buying a single word of it.
Fees.
She looked Kendall dead in the eye and asked if she had pressured Blair to uninvite me because of Preston. Kendall couldn't deny it, and the entire restaurant fell into a suffocating dead silence.
Jim.
Danielle made it official then and there. Kendall and Aubrey were stripped of their roles in the wedding party. They were told they could stay for the ceremony as regular distant guests if they truly wished.
Finish standing by her side.
They wouldn't be giving toasts. They wouldn't be in the photos. And they were officially exiled. They left, and they made sure everyone watched them do it.
Feasant.
Aubrey knocked over a centerpiece on her way out, and Kendall shrieked that Danielle was ungrateful and dramatic. The entire restaurant stared as they stormed out like 2 toddlers throwing a tantrum because they didn't get their way. Preston, who was still somehow on the invite list, just sat there,
Fuse.
looking like he wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear forever. Trevor told me he left shortly after, and he didn't even bother showing up to the actual wedding. The ceremony went on without the Poison twins.
Trevor told me. It was absolutely beautiful.
Danielle looked genuinely happy. They even sent me a piece of wedding cake in a little box, accompanied by a note that said, "Sorry for all the drama. You deserved better."
Thinking.
Deacon and I sat on the couch that Sunday, eating the delicious cake while watching the game, feeling a strange sense of peace. Over the next few days, the full story leaked out, and it was glorious.
Them.
Blair created a backup Instagram account, filling her feed with vague, cryptic posts about toxic masculinity, betrayal, and how people show their true colors when things get hard.
Faded.
The comment section was a mess of supportive friends who didn't know the truth and confused followers asking for context. Her friends rallied around her at first, desperate to play the victim.
Finned.
Kendall posted a massive rant about how Blair had dodged a bullet, talking about how some men just couldn't handle strong, independent women. Aubrey shared it immediately, layering it with fire emojis.
Eason.
But the moment the truth about the rehearsal dinner leaked, the narrative shifted instantly. I didn't have to lift a finger, the rumor mill did the work for me. Blair showed up at my job site 4 days after the wedding.
Fake.
She had clearly been waiting in the yard that morning, watching my crew load up, and then she followed my truck all the way to the site. I hadn't noticed her trailing us, as I was far too focused on the grueling day ahead.
50 feet up.
A utility pole in a quiet neighborhood, working to replace a crossarm that a storm had shredded the night before. I was soaked in sweat, my breath visible in the freezing air.
You.
And I was entirely focused on the mechanics of the job when I heard a commotion echoing from below. My crew lead,
Fela man.
who had been doing this line of work since before I was born, radioed up to ask if I knew the woman currently losing her mind next to my truck. I looked down, squinting against the light.
Fennies.
I saw her car parked illegally in the work zone, and I saw her pacing back and forth like a caged animal. I told Raphael. Yeah, unfortunately, I do. He asked if I wanted him to intervene, but I told him I'd handle it myself. Finished the connection I was working on, secured my tools, and climbed down the pole with deliberate, careful movements. Blair was standing right by my truck when I hit the ground. She looked absolutely wrecked.
Fant.
Her hair was pulled back in a messy, frazzled ponytail, and she was wearing wrinkled yoga pants and a stained t-shirt. She didn't even wait for me to unclip my safety harness before she started. You humiliated me, she spat out.
Her voice cracking with pure desperation.
You absolutely wrecked my reputation. You cost my parents thousands of dollars, and you destroyed my friendships. She glared at me, eyes wild. Are you happy now?
Thingy.
I slowly took off my hard hat and set it in the bed of the truck, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. I didn't say a word. That was the trigger. She completely lost it.
Fent.
She started screaming about how she had given me everything, how she had lowered herself to be with someone like me, and how her friends had warned her from the start that I wasn't good enough, and yet she had defended me.
Fail.
And the rest of the crew suddenly found the equipment across the street. Incredibly fascinating. But I knew they were listening to every single word. I just stood there, waiting until she finally ran out of steam and the shouting died down into ragged breaths. Then, I asked her calmly, when exactly did you defend me? She stumbled, saying it wasn't like that.
He had been under immense pressure.
She started rambling about how Kendall and Aubrey had been whispering in her ear for months, telling her she could do so much better,
Feeplen.
and constantly reminding her that Preston was still interested. She admitted that Preston had reached out multiple times. He told her he missed her, that he'd made a huge mistake letting her go, and that he wanted her back.
He claimed
She had been confused. I asked the only question that mattered. Did you text him back? She hesitated, her silence confirming everything I already knew. Yeah, I said, my voice cold. That's exactly what I thought.
you.
She tried to backpedal, saying nothing had happened, that it was just old friends catching up and seeking closure. She insisted she hadn't done anything wrong.
Thanked he.
I didn't argue with her. There was no point in debating someone who lived in a fantasy world. She started sobbing again, the performative kind of crying that she thought would break me. She told me Shed made a mistake.
She loved me, and that she wanted to fix this.
She claimed Shed do anything. She told me her parents were furious, that Kendall and Aubrey had cut ties with her, and that she had absolutely nothing left.
Feed.
I looked at her for a long, long time. I stared at the woman I had once planned to spend the rest of my life with, and for the first time, I felt absolutely nothing at all.
Fiend.
The morning air was thick with the scent of motor oil and sawdust, the kind of air that usually brings me peace. But today, the silence was heavy, broken only by the shivering sobs of Blair standing in my driveway. Think she looked small, disheveled, and for the first time, truly terrified. She whispered that she had nothing left, that her parents were screaming at her. That Kendall and Aubrey had cut her off without a second thought. She was begging for a bridge I had already burned to the ground. I watched her for a long time, trying to find a trace of the woman I had once promised my life to. This was the same woman who, just weeks ago, had looked at me with cold, sharp eyes and told me I wasn't enough. I wasn't even angry anymore. The rage had burned out after about 12 hours of staring at the ceiling, wondering where I went wrong. Then, vision hit me like a physical weight. She didn't change overnight. She had simply been showing me exactly who she was all along, and I had been too blind to see it. Realization was worth every penny of the heartbreak, she pleaded, asking if there was any way to fix this, any chance to rewrite the script of our disaster. I didn't yell. I just held up my hands. Phew. Showing her the calluses, the deep scars, and the engine grease that never truly scrubs off no matter how hard I wash. I told her these hands paid off her mountain of debt and placed a diamond on her finger. Bing. Only for her to tell her friends that my blue-collar life wasn't good enough for her wedding. I let my hands drop, the finality of it echoing in the quiet garages. We are finished, I said. She stood there, tears carving paths through her foundation, waiting for a crack in my resolve that simply didn't exist. Eventually, she retreated to her car, sitting in the driver's seat for 10 agonizing minutes, just staring at the dash. Then, he drove away, leaving nothing but dust in her wake. Raphael walked over from the workbench, handed me a cold bottle of water, and didn't utter a single word. He knew. I took a long drink, felt the cool liquid hit my chest, and got right back to work. 2 months later, my life had settled into a rhythm that felt right. The house was quieter, yes, but it was also finally mine. I cleared out the pretentious decor she had forced into every corner and replaced it with things I actually liked, making the space feel like a home instead of a showroom. I had successfully returned the engagement ring, pocketing 8 grand after a small restocking fee. The jeweler didn't even pry. He just sighed and said he'd seen it 1,000 times young couples with big dreams colliding with the hard wall of reality. Took that money and invested in a hydraulic lift for the garage. Deacon and I spent an entire weekend installing it, cursing, laughing, and nearly crushing his fingers. But we got it done. Now, tear down engines without ruining my back. I even bought a 1976 Honda CB 750 project bike just to fill the extra space, a complete mechanical overhaul that demanded every bit of my focus. At work, the crew had heard the story through the grapevine, but they were the best kind of friends. They didn't dig. They just cracked jokes and kept the pace. Raphael told me his first wife had left him for a car salesman, and he called it the greatest tragedy that ever turned into a blessing. His second wife was everything the first one wasn't, and half the headache. My parents were different than I expected. Mom was furious at first. Mostly because she realized she had been grieving the version of Blair she had invented in her head. Dad just shook his head, telling me it was better to find out now than 10 years down the road with kids involved. They made sure I wasn't alone, inviting me over for Sunday dinners for an entire month, never pushing, just being there. Deacon was there every weekend too. Wed fish, work on the Honda, grill steaks that Blair would have turned her nose up at because they weren't fine dining enough. Deacon even started seeing a nurse named Alina he met at a blood drive. She was real, salt of the earth, and she didn't have a single fake bone in her body. She actually helped me bleed the brakes on the Honda, laughing when she told me she grew up helping her dad in the shop. I told Deacon to keep that one, or he'd be the biggest fool in the world. As for Blair, the rumors filtered down to me through Trevor. She had crawled back to her parents' house because she couldn't afford a single month of rent without my income subsidizing her lifestyle. She hadn't saved a dime. The whole time we were together. Why would she when I was paying for everything? Meredith was apparently livid, constantly reminding Blair how much money they had wasted on the canceled deposits.
Yoon.
Gerald was worse. He was just profoundly disappointed. Trevor told me he ran into Gerald at the hardware store, and the man just shook his head, saying he really liked that kid, and Blair had truly thrown away something golden.
After I sold our car.
Blair was stuck driving her mother's clunky 12-year-old Camry with a dented bumper and a broken Aka car she would have mocked ruthlessly a year ago. Kendall and Aubrey didn't cut her off instantly.
But it was classic slow fade.
First, they were too busy for brunch. Then they had other plans, and after the rehearsal dinner disaster, the fade became a total block. They blamed her for the whole mess,
Feared.
claiming she shouldn't have been so transparent about the uninvite. Within a month, they had replaced her in their circle with some girl from their Pilates class, and Blair found out via Instagram.
Feel.
The hotel job turned into a nightmare for her, too. Danielle told Trevor that Blair was slipping, missing deadlines, and constantly showing up late. They demoted her, pulled her off the high-profile events, and 3 months later,
He was gone.
I assume they offered her the choice of quitting or being escorted out. She tried to reach out through mutual friends a few times, fishing for a second chance. But people were tired of the drama.
Thinged.
Danielle told her straight. Shed had her chance, and she blew it. I don't feel a shred of pity for her. She chose her path, and now she has to walk it. I hope she finds whatever it is she thinks she deserves.
He won't be from me.
She isn't my problem anymore. Guys, we are so close to hitting 100,000 subscribers on this channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider hitting that button.
Thus reach this goal.
Thanks for being part of this journey and helping turn this dream into a reality.